All right, so welcome, part two, the introduction video lecture for HI 152 for this summer. Now we started off, we got through the convention, and we got through the Revolution of 1800. Now slavery would remain a major issue, and the political divide between those who favored a strong central government and those who supported states' rights would also continue, and very much it revolved around the slavery issue for some. Now, of course, today, strong federal government would be the Democrats, and those who favored states' rights would be Republicans. Now, compromise would continue to dominate. In 1820, we have the Missouri Compromise. It's one of many on the long road to mutual conciliation. Missouri entered the Union as a slave state, balanced by Maine entering as a free state. Additionally, it was decided that any territory north of 3630 parallel would not be allowed to be a slave area. Now, this is partially about power in Congress. Slave states do not want to allow a free state to take power, and vice versa. And so this is one of the reasons that we continue to have these issues as we expand. The era of compromise would continue in 1850 and later the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which would negate the 1820 compromise and set the stage for many of the violent conflicts that would engage the nation in the following decade. 1850, that compromise, allowed California as a free state, and there would be no slavery restrictions in Utah or New Mexico territories. The slave trade was prohibited in the District of Columbia, but slaveholding was permitted. The Fugitive Slave Law was enacted, and this was the key. It required those in the North to return fugitive slaves to their owners in the South. So this very much went against the abolitionist view, went against what many in the North believed was the right thing to do. But this fugitive slave law was very important, and it would only lead to more conflict. Again, this tugged at the conscience of many and drew a reaction that led to the rise of this abolitionist movement. Also important was the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Now, this work showed Americans, and actually those around the world, the horrors of slavery and concomitantly the need to get rid of it. During the war, Lincoln himself, when he met Stowe, reported to have said, quote, "So this is the little lady who started this big war." Now, the Kansas-Nebraska Act negated the Louisiana Purchase part of 1820. Stephen Douglas, who had battled Lincoln for a congressional seat in Illinois and was the other half of the famous Douglas-Lincoln debates, wanted Nebraska to be an official territory, and he offered Kansas as the southern counterpart. Rather than simply create another free state and another slave state, he called for popular sovereignty. Now, what is popular sovereignty? Douglas wanted the settlers in each territory to decide for themselves if they wanted slavery. It barely passed, and those in the North were infuriated. Specifically, Northern Whigs broke away from Southern Whigs over this and would create the Republican Party. But this also led to a clash within Kansas as border ruffians from Missouri would cross the border and promote slavery, inciting violence between the two states. Now, again, the goal here was to get those in Kansas to vote to make Kansas a slave state. That would, again, further empower slave states in general and spread the peculiar institution. Ultimately, there would be two governments in Kansas and unending violence. 200 people would ultimately die in these conflicts that were associated with the division of Kansas. And those in Lawrence, as somebody who went to graduate school down there, they are quite proud that the town is known as a bastion of anti-slavery sentiments. And you have the Free State Brewery, which every KU student has gone to at least a couple times. We'll leave it at that. Further violence would happen in Congress, if you can believe that. Charles Sumner, a Massachusetts senator, gave a speech entitled "The Crime Against Kansas," and he would literally be caned by South Carolina Representative Preston Brooks, who claims that he was only upholding the honor of his distant cousin, South Carolina Senator Andrew Butler. Now, Sumner had attacked pro-slavery interests. He was uncivilized in these attacks. He was a nasty man, and he was nasty to Butler. And that's why Brooks came and literally caned him on the Senate floor. Now, while he did this, others were trying to get by, maybe to try to stop it, but they were held back by other Southern senators. So again, this is a very ugly episode, and I would highly recommend you actually Google that, because you can find there's some really interesting newspaper artwork, cartoons drawn from it, everything, which show just the barbarity of the action. So blood is shed on the floor of the Senate chamber. Sumner would never fully recover. but he was nasty in his speech against the South and Butler and had been one of the more outspoken critics of slavery, often making it a personal issue between he and the supporters of slavery. And that, again, underscores why he was treated with such disdain. Now, the nation was quite divided. So in 1860, Abraham Lincoln is elected president, and this begins what many historians refer to as the Lincolnian era of American government, one which fostered the growth and the power of the federal government. This also represents the end of Jeffersonian America, the era of states' rights above all, and that was now passing. This was one thing that scared Southerners. Lincoln never promised to end slavery when he was on the campaign trail, nor did he state he would make this his goal during the presidency. So why did Southern states secede immediately after the election? Well, the Republican Party, and Lincoln was a member of this, was created as an anti-slavery party. Lincoln did have moral convictions against slavery. Most importantly, arguably, was that he wanted to stop the spread of slavery into new territory. States' rights are often argued as the reason for the Civil War, especially by those in the South, and this is true to an extent. But what does it all boil down to? The right to have slaves. Southern states wanted to continue the practice of slavery unabated and wanted no end to its spread into new territories. The Civil War pitted Unionists versus Confederates, while the South versus North would be the general division. There were people from each side that lived in the other's territory. It was not as simple as a region versus region conflict. I'm not going to get into all the battles. I will mention one, and that is Gettysburg. Why was Gettysburg so important? Not only was it a pivotal three-day battle in the war, but up until that time, much of the war had been a stalemate. The Confederacy hoped for a win at Gettysburg to garner support and recognition from Europe, support it had nearly earned up until Antietam. But a loss here would deny them this much-needed support. More importantly, there was hope a victory here would crush Republican hopes and strengthen Northern Democrats, which would then lead to the ouster of Lincoln and peace on friendly terms to the South. Now, in the 1964 election, McClellan would run against Lincoln. McClellan was one of the early leaders of the war for the Union. He was kind of Lincoln's right-hand man. He was very well respected as a military leader, but he would also commit many goofs, if you will, that probably prolonged the war. But he was a Democrat, and he argued that if he was elected president, he would just end the war immediately. So again, a victory at Gettysburg would lead some of these in the North to finally decide, hey, let's go with a pro-peace candidate, let's end this war. Now, Lincoln himself said he would do anything to preserve the Union, even if it meant maintaining slavery. Importantly, in an 1862 letter to Horace Greeley, who was the editor of the New York Times, Lincoln stated, "My paramount object in the struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save this Union, and what I forbear because I do not believe it would help to save the Union." Lincoln was very much a pragmatist. He is considered a national hero, and he should be, but this does show you that it was more about, the war was about preserving the Union, not about ending slavery. Well, until a little bit later. Now, due to some misjudgment by Robert E. Lee and lackadaisical work by some of his generals, we know the Union defeated the Confederacy at Gettysburg, Pickett's charge being the final blow. Europe did not recognize the Confederacy, and Lincoln would go on to win the presidency in 1864, both of which crippled Confederate hopes for victory. Lincoln ran in 1864 against Little Mac, George McClellan, as I mentioned, the man who had been put in charge of the military 3 separate times during the Civil War. McClellan was known as a professional but cautious leader. He was charismatic. He was well loved. Again, he ran as a Democrat in 1864, and Lincoln believed that Little Mac would beat him, hands down. Lincoln was certain he would be a one-term president. But Gettysburg and the Emancipation Proclamation would help to assure victory. In April of 1965, the Civil War would eventually end, and we know Lincoln would be gunned down by the Brad Pitt of his era, John Wilkes Booth. Southerner Andrew Johnson would become president, and he failed the test miserably. Now, I mentioned the Brad Pitt of his era. John Wilkes Booth was a very popular actor. He was very handsome. He was always hounded for autographs. Women loved him. So I say that because, consider Brad Pitt murdering the president today. You would be shocked by who did it, not only the fact that it was done, but that is kind of what we see at that time. And Booth, of course, thought that everybody would rally behind him, that everybody would support him. He was shocked when even Southerners disdained his action. Now, Johnson again becomes president. Andrew Johnson, Reconstruction, in many ways sums up American history, and this will be our last topic at the for this particular video. This was a time of compromise, a time when the right thing could have been done, but ultimately was not. It was a time when different groups vied for power, but many waffled. A time when the power of the federal government expanded a great deal, but states' rights would still be preserved. Big questions remained. What should we do? Punish the South? Should we reconcile with the South? And what to do with African Americans? What rights should they have? What should we do with them? Johnson's Reconstruction allowed the South to run itself in many ways. He required former Confederates to give an oath of loyalty to protect the 13th Amendment, and if so, he returned all property and rights to them. Now, if you're a Confederate leader, aren't you just going to, oh yeah, I'm loyal. If you're going to free me and give me all my stuff back and let me have my power again. So that's essentially what happened. He would pardon over 7,000 former Confederates. Southern states enacted what were called black codes, which severely limited the freedom of African Americans. For example, they had to provide proof that they had a job, or they would have to work plantations. Not as slaves, but still with limited options. They had to pay a special tax if they were not farmers or servants. They were barred from public facilities. The Freedmen's Bureau, which was established to ease transition to emancipation, was very much left helpless to do much as states had retaken power. Now, many agreed with this. They simply wanted to be done with the conflict. And make no mistake, it's not like those in the North were not racist as well or viewed African Americans as true equals. As the old saying goes, the Northerners did not want African Americans as slaves, but they also didn't want them as neighbors. But a group of radical Republicans were not about to allow Johnson to be steamrolled by the South. They wanted change, and they made it happen. They believed African Americans should enjoy the same rights as whites, and they wanted to punish the South. They believed this was an extraordinary time and that the federal government should be empowered to enforce this change. This group devised the Civil Rights Bill of 1866, which extended the Freedmen's Bureau and provided more opportunity for African Americans. But Johnson vetoed it. They also molded the 14th Amendment to provide equal legal protection for African Americans, rendering them natural citizens to enjoy all the rights thereof. That is important. That is a huge step. The Reconstruction Act of 1867 stripped the right to vote or hold office from former Confederate leaders. I told you they wanted revenge, and this is one way they did it. Further, this act divided the South into 5 military districts and provided the Army to protect African Americans and their property. It was very much like a nation being occupied by another. Through all this, Johnson resisted. He would be impeached, the first president to be so, the second being Bill Clinton. Now, Clinton lied to the people, but was he as bad as Johnson? No. So again, Andrew Johnson is the first American president impeached. And under radical Reconstruction, African Americans could not vote, hold property, go to school, and many actually became state and national representatives. They still suffered economically in many ways. They often were under radical Reconstruction, African Americans could vote and hold property. They still suffered economically in many ways. They often were stuck with being sharecroppers because of a lack of knowledge of other work or professions. So many were still very much under the authority of whites. But the Freedmen's Bureau went a long way toward easing them into this new life, offering education, protection, and guidance to those who were left behind. Now this brings us up to the 1876 election, which is, I would argue, probably one of the most significant events in American history. The 76th election would change everything. Samuel Tilden ran against Rutherford B. Hayes. Neither was a fantastic candidate, and the election was a toss-up. Now, Tilden won the popular vote, but he was 1 vote shy of the electoral vote. Hayes was 20 short of the electoral vote. A commission was set up to investigate and determine the results, and in the end, in classic American fashion, a compromise was reached, and this one would have long-lasting effects on the Republic. Hayes was given the presidency. Hayes is a Republican. He is given the presidency, but with certain conditions, namely that the federal army be removed from southern states. There are others, federal legislation to spur industrialization in the South, an appointment of Democrats to patronage positions in the South, and the appointment of a Democrat to the candidate. But again, the most important thing is the federal army, federal troops are removed from the southern states. Thus, Reconstruction was over. The South was once again left to its own devices. African Americans in the South would refer to this as the Great Betrayal. Some called it the corrupt bargain, but to history it is known as the Great Compromise of 1877. but there was nothing great about it. The federal government expanded greatly during this time, but states were still left with a solid amount of power, and in the South, this meant a return to the traditional treatment of African Americans. Now, post-Reconstruction, you have different ways of manipulating African Americans, restricting the right to vote. You have poll taxes, literacy tests, other limits on the franchise. The Plessy versus Ferguson decision by the Supreme Court toward the end of the 19th century essentially legalized segregation. Then we have the introduction of Jim Crow laws. And again, all this is abetted by the Compromise of 1877. We take the troops out of the South, we end Reconstruction before it should be ended, and again, this leaves the South to their own devices. Nothing great about that compromise, but again, it is quite important in our history. Now, this class will pick up right at the end of that.